Chris, if you're speaking, you may be on mute.
Yes, I was on mute. Sorry. Give me one sec. And cool. What I was trying to say was, is it all good to start? But yeah, I'll start.
All good.
Cool. So yeah, I'm here to talk about prototyping. If someone could go on mute, please, because there's a bit of feedback. Cool. That's better. Yeah. So just in case there's anyone here who doesn't know, I'm from FutureGov. We're FutureGov, FutureGov's change agency, on a mission to build 21st century public sector institutions. But yeah, I'm fairly sure everyone here has probably heard this before. But this is the FutureGov stuff. And as you may or probably already know, we've built two websites together, the new North and West websites. And yeah, prototyping was a core part of this. So we're going to go through some different prototyping methods now. I'm Chris. I'm a senior product designer at FutureGov. A product designer is, there's a bit of spiel there about it, but essentially someone who uses different facets and tools of design to create and execute a solution that improves and solves problems in the user experience. So the core thing being there, user's experience. So we're really the aim is always it's focused on the user and trying to create solutions to improve their experience through different, whether it's services, products, websites. It varies, but that's the core principle for it. But prototyping isn't just limited to product designers. Everyone prototypes. You may be prototyping without even realize you are prototyping. It's a kind of fundamental part of all design and not just design, but essentially creating things. Here is a rough agenda, although for me that has not changed. Oh, there we go. A rough agenda of what we're going to talk about, essentially the what, why, how, all about prototyping. So what is prototyping? Firstly, we'd like to get your thoughts on it. So hopefully everyone's used Menti before, but if not, give me a shout and I will bring up this. So Connolly, you're right to just paste the details into the chat as well, please.
I would love to, but I have signed in, I think, using a different account, and unfortunately, Fiona, I cannot paste into the chat. But if you go to menti.com, or Fiona can paste in the chat on my behalf, www.menti.com on your phone or on another tab, it will ask you for a code. The code is 63230364. We've got one person on there already. And we're hoping to get about, I guess, 10 responses for us to kind of discuss. Brilliant.
So, yeah, you may already see it coming in, but essentially I just wanted to ask, what are three words that come to mind when you think of prototyping? I think we almost have everyone having a different word. But test, yeah.
I like the opening a door. I haven't seen that one before. It's a good way of describing it.
Yeah. Throwaway, that's an interesting one. Definitely important. Cool, I think we might, oh, got some more coming through. find myself craning my neck trying to read them.
This is really interesting, actually. I've done a few lunch and learns on prototyping. This is the first time this team have put through things about temporary, throwaway. This is something that normally after the session people kind of like learn and think about. But yeah, Chris will talk more about that. Really interesting that some people have already put that on there. And if you're wondering why, you'll find out shortly.
Cool. I think we might be about there, but we'll export all of this out and put it into the deck for sharing as well. But yeah, it's as Connie said, really interesting and good signs for. I mean, maybe you don't need to be in this prototyping session because you'll know quite a bit already by the looks of it. The second one I wanted to ask was, how much experience do you think you have of prototyping on a scale of 1 to 5? So if you're still in the Menti, there we go. Be interesting to know with something like this whether people are influenced seeing what other people are voting, or how different it would be if it was hidden until the end. I think we've got most people, so fairly consistent middle ground, but not as much prototyping by the looks of it, which is good because that's why we're here. Cool. So I'm going to go back to deck. Oh. There we go. Cool. Thank you for that. That's really useful and good to know. So what is prototyping? I tried in the shortest possible sentence I could find. It's a tool to learn from, and it's an experiment to test assumptions. So as I think in the word cloud you saw, testing, test were some of the biggest words. That's spot on. The point of a prototype is to test. In a slightly longer one, because I couldn't decide between the two. Prototyping is the process of mocking up an idea quickly and with minimal resource in order to assess and improve its viability, desirability, and feasibility. These three are really important. I'll touch on them in a bit, but they are the kind of core basis of what a prototype is about. I wanted to touch on MVPs while we're talking about prototypes because I'm sure a lot of people have heard of minimum viable products, and I think that a lot of the times when people talk about prototyping, some people might be thinking about MVPs, or when they're talking about MVPs, they might be thinking about prototyping, and the lines can be quite blurry between the two. And I think it's confused a lot, but it makes sense that it's confused because it is confusing. So what I wanted to say here is that a prototype is not necessarily an MVP, but an MVP is a prototype, and it all comes down to scale. So an MVP is a prototype, but a lot further along in the product development process. You might have tested a variety of different prototypes in order to get to that MVP. That MVP might be built up from multiple prototypes, but the main thing here is that an MVP, a prototype is not necessarily MVP. Yeah. So just to touch on minimum viable products, you might have seen this kind of definition before, but I find this makes the most sense in my head in terms of if you're building a new product, a new website, a new service, anything, you might take the kind of traditional approach at the top, which is where you have to build each and every part of that product before it's a usable thing that people can access and use and utilize. So obviously it takes a very long time. There's lots of planning. Things don't change throughout. Whereas at the bottom, you have the idea that the minimum viable product being someone needs to get from A to B. In this example, the skateboard can do that, and it's the most minimal thing we can do right now to test that concept. So,
and the biggest thing here, I think, is the concept we're trying to test in this diagram is mode of transport. So it's not the brief wasn't please build me a car. It is I want to get to a place from A to B. So you can see the skateboard does the job. It does provide value. So does the scooter. So does the bike, and also does the car. But it's basically allowing someone to complete the task or the service or basically going and from A to B may not be as quick as the very last version of the car, but it does get you there. So the whole thing is making sure that you're releasing, if you're releasing software or if you're releasing service iterations to make sure that there's value to the end user.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, another thing to flag, as you've obviously already mentioned in the word cloud, and as with MVPs, not all prototypes will become the final product. They need to be throwawayable. They need to be something that doesn't necessarily survive, because the point of them is to test and to test your assumptions. So I just thought I'd bring in some. The slide hasn't changed again for me. I don't know if it's changing for anyone else.
I can see Northant's prototype's light blue background.
How strange. On my screen, there we go. I just have to flick through. So yeah, I wanted to bring through some of the prototypes to show kind of the contrast between some of the prototypes we were creating and the MVP. So here is just an example of one of the kind of more higher fidelity prototypes we created when we were designing the Northants websites. So the goal of this prototype was to test out how a user can essentially find their way back to a service on the old sites. There was also some concept around being able to kind of customize or personalize the site to yourself, which was part of this prototype. So just as an example, part of this was thrown away because it wasn't as essential. It wasn't part of the MVP. It wasn't minimally viable, and that was this kind of functionality. And here we have another one. So these are kind of higher fidelity, and we call them clickable prototypes or interactive prototypes or experience prototypes. There's loads of different names for this kind of thing, but essentially these are just flat screens which you can see when I'm clicking. You get the blue clickable areas, which allow you to make it feel like it's a real prototype, and then these can be tested with users. Make it feel like it's a real website. Sorry. So this prototype allows you to kind of really quickly test a website's design and interaction. And yeah, you can see on that one, it was about how a user can access the kind of making a complaint within the contact us, as opposed to the MVP, which we built and went live. So you may have seen we had the staging sites, which is where we were testing the initial builds of the websites. So within this, it was an MVP of the entire website. So we had to have a minimally viable experience of all of those. What we just saw in those prototypes needed to be accessible and usable with real live content that is changeable. So there's quite a stark contrast between the amount of resource that goes into the two different like a small scale prototype versus this MVP. So why prototype? As I said before, it allows us to test ideas and assumptions. The main thing here being quickly and cheaply. So this quote is a great one from IDEO, but if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. It may feel like when you're creating prototypes, it feels like a longer process than it needs to be, but actually it helps things go a lot faster. You can get to an answer a lot quicker. Essentially, sketching something or drawing something on a whiteboard, you can get people on the same page as opposed to sitting around talking about it. So it's doing it again for me. There we go. Essentially, when we're prototyping, it's an iterative process. So we want to do this early and often. The main time that we're prototyping is this ideation and experimenting phase, because it's simpler, it's less complex. You test with fewer people. It's obviously cheap, and when you're getting to that kind of MVP beta service or a live service, it becomes a lot more complex. You need to open up to real users, and obviously it costs a lot more. And just to touch on the fact that this is iterative, this is a process where obviously you're designing, prototyping is part of that design, and then you test, evaluate, and then bring the learnings from that back into the design to change the prototype, iterate it, throw it away, start again. This is a process that changes over time through the learnings. It's not something that goes from A to B. So yeah, a big part of this is that we're trying to test hypotheses, however you say it, not features. So are we solving the right problem? Are we solving the problem right? These two are intertwined, and the prototypes are there to help us test this hypothesis. So you may have already been involved in some of this work, but before we were even creating the prototypes, we want to come up with what our hypotheses are for that we want to test, and then the prototype helps us test that and learn from it. So again, as I've said, the part of this is that we're designing the simplest solution. So what is the smallest thing you can build a prototype for to test? And I think a really interesting thing about prototyping is the kind of versatility of how you can fake it. So it doesn't need to work technically at all. You can fake it because it's not about the technicality of how it works. It's about how people use it and the learnings you get from testing it. So just some examples. If you had the hypothesis that a chatbot would be particularly useful for a service, in terms of someone finding out some information or navigating their way through a service, you could test this through the use of manual text messages. So you could have a testing scenario where someone thinks that they're talking to a chatbot, they're typing in messages, and essentially it just be an open message thread between yourself going through the script that you're creating for the chatbot, because something like a chatbot is a massive resource intensive thing to build. It would take a very, very large amount of time to build a chatbot, but you may end up realizing through prototyping it and testing it that actually it's not the right thing, and so yeah, spending all that time building the chatbot as opposed to not testing it, you may end up wasting a lot of time. Another example for this that you may have seen a lot is building a form. So forms can be fairly complicated to build, and they can be costly and expensive. So using something like Typeform or one of the kind of quick and easy type form builders, you can test out the flow and the questions. So as an example here, what you're testing here is not the functionality of the form. It is the content, it is the flow, it is ensuring that all makes sense before you even get to the point of building that form.
One thing I'll just mention here as a real life example, Chris, is when I was in Australia, one of the startups that I was working had this idea about actually selling fresh seafood online. Imagine like Seabay, like eBay, but for seafood. And it's this idea that came up, and to validate it for investors, what we decided to do was prototype the idea through a form. So what we did was created a splash page or a single page website, which basically asked people to kind of like sign up if they'd like to hear more, and that allowed him to gather the data and say, we have XYZ, like I'm going to say 1,000 is a round number, 1,000 people interested in the service. So investors would then invest in that idea to then build out the remaining product. So yeah, forms are a really good way to get people's data. And if you're able to get people's data, obviously GDPR compliant, you'll be able to then use that as a stat to then put forward to potential investors. So a way that a lot of startups, yeah, kind of like prototype their idea is with a form. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, also on that, actually, I think I've got another slide showing different kind of methods of prototyping, but testing appetite is another really useful thing for prototyping, and that could be simply through creating like a video which shows how the service works. So you might have seen this before with a lot of startups, in the same way that Connolly was just saying, where you might have a video of the full service. It might be mock-ups, prototypes, or however, but that's the goal of that isn't necessarily to test the service itself, is to test appetite for it, specifically for things like funding startups. But yeah, and the other example I've got there is communication. So again, you may want to test out how you, like there's different variations of this, but you might want to test out how you're notifying people, or similar to the chatbot, how you're kind of communicating between the service and the service user. So there's things like obviously Gov Notify, which is a very cheap and simple to use system for kind of sending out emails, text messages, but they also send out, you can send out mail as well, like physical letters. So it's an easy way to test that kind of service. And Twilio is there's plenty of other examples like that, but Twilio is another one, especially good for testing out communications and phone calls and things like that. So what can you prototype? The answer to that is kind of almost anything. So I think obviously the work we've been doing with Northants so far has been on the two websites. So a lot of the prototyping work you would have thought about or seen is focused on that second one. It's product. It's a website. It's a thing. But really, you can prototype anything. Obviously, there's a long list here: campaigns, services, systems, strategies, policies, organization structures, content, another big one. And really, again, it all comes back down to what is the simplest thing we can do to test our assumptions for all of these things, rather than just going ahead and building our assumption before it's been tested. So yeah, any solution that people experience to reach a goal, you can test. So obviously from A to B is the example we keep using, but any experience people currently have, whether, if we go back, sorry, whether or not that is something like an organization structure, something that's completely different, that people are experiencing that, and you can test a future experience. So what are we testing? I said at the beginning, these desirability, feasibility, and viability being the big three things. So it's testing whether or not people will use it. That is desirability, and testing feasibility of what is required to make it, and the viability is how it's possible for the organization to sustain it. So we tend to start with desirability, because there's no point in worrying about how feasible something is or viable it is if people aren't interested in it, or it's not a desirable experience or a desirable prototype. So yeah, it's the if, how, and why. And what we're testing here is whether or not people will change their behaviors. So is this new future experience, the interaction of this, better than the current experience that people are experiencing? So the main things we tend to test are, as I've said, content, product, data is another thing, and processes and services. So these two separate colors are slightly different. The tools and methods you use to test or to prototype these things are slightly different. So I just want to show you some of these now. So obviously testing content, data, and products. You might be coming up with kind of proof of concepts. You've seen these kind of like sketches and ideas before, but we can create prototypes to test out. There's a video here of testing out essentially sketches. So we're testing in a mock-up, but all done on paper-based. So this is a paper prototype, and while this is still fairly resource intensive to build and test all of this, there's a reason sometimes it's useful spending this time, because one of the reasons you might want to test it like this is that you remove any of the additional kind of distractions or cognitive load that come into it when you're testing for testing content. So we're testing in this example, we're testing the content and the flow, and we're not worrying about any of the visual design, things like branding and logos and colors and type. All of that kind of thing can get in the way of the learnings that you want to learn. So
just on this, Chris, I wonder if we pause here and see if anyone's got questions about this, I guess, prototype paper example that which has been played on the screen. We're a pretty small group, so I wonder, has anyone actually done a test like this before? Or is this the first time as people have seen a test like this?
It looks like marble, only that it's the actual paper. But we used to like sketch them out and then take pictures from a mobile and put them in a small app that you could click through. But this is more kind of hands-on. It's nice, tangible.
Lawrence, I'm expecting this now from your directories mock-ups. This is the next stage.
It's a kind of a Blue Peter approach. It's nice. I like it. Do you like guide people on what to do and ask questions as you go along, or do you give them more silent time to contemplate the action?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the main goals here is it helps people to talk about, like explain and think about what they're doing. So when testing, you may have seen before, you try and you encourage people to kind of talk out loud. It's a very unnatural thing to do, like your thought processes. But you can see in this example, there's a list of kind of tasks, because obviously similar to the blue boxes that pop up on the clickable prototypes, that there is certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. So that there needs to be a small amount of guidance on something like this.
The best thing about this is if you haven't worked with Chris is what we call in the industry a unicorn, because he can design and code. But there's often people who are very, very talented at user research, but they're not designers. And this is a way that any of us could actually sketch out an example paper prototype and use Post-it notes and do these testing in person. So it really, really helps if you're working with, say, that example that Chris was sharing is of an app. So imagine like your banking app and you want to test a new flow. So there's the flow on the left-hand side, 1 to 5. And a tip that I've had is I've actually placed masking tape around the prototype before, because often when you bring a user tester in, they actually pick it up. They want to actually hold it. And so you actually just want to see where people click or hypothetically point on the screen. So having something that's actually on the table and you can actually follow things and actually film that will allow the researchers and the designers to understand a little bit more about the user needs as they go through the flow. We've got a hand up. Let's see who it is. I can't see on Teams.
Gavin.
Gavin.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, is one of the advantages of using it manually is that obviously if you're doing it through the actual real iPad or phone, you're expecting a finished product because you're so used to using that phone or iPad. Whereas if you're using it in a paper form, it feels like you're in test mode.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
So you got the feeling bit as well.
And one fun thing that one of my user researchers, when I was note taking, in interaction design, when something goes wrong, sometimes the button does a little shake or there's a noise that like you'd be used to, like bow, bow, or like, little things. So sometimes the user researcher, to help trigger, like you'll see this, I think in the next, the screen before, actually, if it plays again, Chris, there's one point where the user clicks on something and nothing happens. So I'm imagining that there'd be some sort of indication, whether it be the researcher like wiggling the screen of some sort or something to show them that they aren't able to complete that click. So if you watch now, he goes through, he clicks, that brings up this new screen, clicks again, that brings up that, he clicks on that again, nothing happens. So there must be some sort of indication for him to actually press back, but you can see that might then allow the next round of prototypes. So when it gets to a higher fidelity, so if fidelity means it just gets into a more polished, so a higher fidelity, if you could imagine, is like a prototype which is clickable and it's been designed on a tool called Figma or Envision. There's many different tools out there, where lower fidelity is just this, a pencil sketch.
You're jumping ahead. There's some slides on fidelity in a minute.
Sneak peek.
But yeah. So the other thing is, like, obviously this is more advanced for testing with a user in a kind of a specific user testing scenario. But one of the other things about testing on paper like this that's really useful is even when you're in the kind of designs side of things, when you're coming up with how you want things laid out and mocked up, is that with paper you can very easily move it. So one of the things I often do is use things like Post-it notes to mock up a website. Let's say you can imagine each Post-it note is kind of a component or a thing. It means you can then in a room with people that you're designing it, you can essentially move that Post-it note and say, actually, I think this component, this section would go better here, or this section would be better here. So it's another way you can test that kind of thing. So yeah, that was focused much more on testing content, data, products. The other side of things, which I think is it's harder to get your kind of head around conceptually, is the idea of testing services, processes. So yeah, alongside the product that we're building, we need to test the experience that happens around that product. the people who are involved, the processes, the tools. And so part of this is obviously visualizing these. So you would have seen kind of service blueprints and like journey mapping and things where we can kind of try and visualize the actual experience itself. But another thing, there we go. Another thing is kind of to prototype these is an entirely different experience, because it moves out of that digital or paper space, because you're testing a service's or a process's interactions and observing them. So there's some examples here. There's an IDO with Lufthansa version at the top, where they were testing an entirely new experience for an aeroplane. So a much simpler way of testing that, obviously, than using an aeroplane is just to mock up that experience and role play that out. So they had obviously visuals to make it seem like an aeroplane, things made with cardboard, airplane seats, and invited users, staff, and senior stakeholders, project sponsors to test the new approach, and having them experience the service allows them to buy into it a lot more and feel like it's a real thing. So in the example at the bottom, I don't know if anyone's seen The Founder, the film about how McDonald's was founded. If you haven't, there's a great bit where they're essentially trying to come up with a better way of organizing their cooking stations to speed up how they can obviously make burgers and make it more efficient. So they go to a big tennis court, draw out the different stations with chalk on the floor, and get their cooks and the people working there to play out and role play the idea that they're creating these burgers, and then they keep iterating and changing it and iterating it over and over again until they've kind of choreographed the way the food can be developed. So yeah, that's another example of kind of prototyping at an experience. So yeah, this is there's something called Wizard of Oz testing, which is quite similar, I guess, to where I was talking about testing chatbots, where where you are essentially playing the chatbot. So the main thing about this, which can also be used in kind of testing services and processes, is reducing that kind of effort of building any technology. So or when it comes to services, it might be reducing the effort of kind of the training that is required in delivering that service. So similar to kind of Wizard of Oz, it's this behind the scenes person kind of controlling the thing, and it's a way of kind of faking something to make it look more automatic in the eyes of the user, and behind the scenes it may not be done automatically. So for kind of services and processes, this might be faking a payment system or faking the migration of data between different systems. But what it does is it allows you to test these things out before building them. So going more into the specifics of how to prototype, there's a list of kind of other resources and things, but this one's quite useful. It's service design tools, and each one of this is their list of kind of prototyping tools or methods, and often, obviously, these have different names, but we've kind of already talked about like rough prototyping, as in kind of paper prototyping and sketches. But each one of these has a load more detail on this site, so I'd really recommend having an explore. But one of the big ones we've also used a lot in Northants is experience prototypes, those kind of clickable prototypes I showed at the beginning. because obviously we're designing a new digital experience, and I've just talked about role playing, but yeah, there's other different things, things like Service Safari, which is testing out the actual experience of the current service, and yeah, there's lots to go through. As Connolly was just talking about, there's different levels of fidelity. So you often might hear us say a higher fidelity or low fidelity, and essentially when it comes to in this example, this is kind of more of that what do they call it, experience prototype. So redesigning a site. So you may have lower fidelity or higher fidelity being kind of sketches, wireframing, all the way up to the kind of high fidelity mockups, and this is kind of a scale that so you might have you might start with wireframes or sketches, and then they slowly become higher and higher fidelity as they iterate and design. But essentially, it's the level of the detail and the resources involved equals that fidelity. So this is another example of kind of a wireframe, a sketch, a wireframe, and then a higher fidelity one. So the things you kind of want to consider when deciding kind of what fidelity you want to prototype in is what is the level of detail for the conversations you want to trigger at this stage. So again, it comes down to what are we trying to learn. So as I've kind of mentioned, the one on the right, the highest fidelity, is great because you're testing what it might really look like. But if you're trying to test the content or the flow, as I said, the color, the imagery, the branding, that might actually get in the way of testing those things. That's where something like a wireframe can come in really handy. So it's not always just about the resource of, obviously, it's much cheaper and quicker to create a lower fidelity. Sometimes you want to create a lower fidelity prototype specifically to try and test an assumption and not have people worrying about the colors that they like or logos and imagery. But yeah, each one of these obviously can flow from one to the other. You could start, obviously the majority of the time people start sketching, and then they move into wireframes and go to high fidelity, but you can kind of, depending on the situation, move straight into high fidelity or go into lower. So you might find that through testing the lower fidelity things, you don't even want to create the higher fidelity. So it's really useful to kind of move between these levels of fidelity. On the higher end, so obviously we have kind of clickable prototypes and things like that, but you can also create HTML prototypes, which become a lot more, they tend to be a lot more resource intensive, but they are much more interactive. Like they are like almost the real thing. And recently it's becoming a lot easier to do this as well. So it's becoming less resource intensive. So I don't know if anyone's had an experience with the GDS digital prototyping kit, but that if you have a kind of it allows people to create prototypes specifically around GDS's kind of one question per page flows and things like that. But it allows you to create them very, very simply. Like you don't necessarily need to be an advanced developer in order to do them. They are fairly simple to do and quick to test out. And you can then test more advanced flows. So often when you're creating a high fidelity prototype, they become super resource intensive. When it's a clickable kind of thing in Figma, they become super resource intensive when it's when it gets to a kind of a very, very complicated flow where you might have in this kind of branching, so depending on what you choose, it might take you to a different step, and then that might have different branching and more branching, and it becomes really complicated. Whereas in HTML, something like that is actually simpler to build than it is to do in Figma. So it really depends on what you're trying to test as to what prototype is best for it, and obviously, as I said, how much time and resource you have to do it. So I've just talked quite a bit for the last 50 minutes. It'd be good to try some stuff together. So I know a lot of the people on this call will know, as we've talked about, you're currently working on directories. So redesigning the current directories and trying to create some new concepts for that. As part of that work, as we've said, we came up with hypotheses that you want to test. So these are some of the hypotheses from your workshop that you created, and then what you're next doing is creating prototypes in order to test some of these things. So Lawrence, you're on the call, right?
Yes, I am. Yep.
Yes. Cool. I was wondering if you could just talk us through these prototypes. I don't know if you want to share the screen, or I can just share the Figma and go through them.
Yeah, if you share your Figma, then I can talk through them. Yeah.
Cool. So hopefully everyone can see this.
And Chris, this may be the first time people on the call are seeing this. So yeah, Lawrence, feel free to give as much context as you like as we go through one by one.
Right. So this is a culmination of a series of workshops with the Lean team and analysis of data on how people use websites to find council tax information. We are able to establish some of the things that people are interested in, and the things that people would be looking for, and comparing that with what is provided at the moment in the current legacy websites, we're able to see a clear difference and to reprioritize the needs before we present them to actual people to test. So these high fidelity mockups will help because they fall in the same kind of a style as the current websites, the West. So we started with the West. And any other background? So this, one of the other objectives of this is to find a way of structuring this narrative data in a way that we can have a reusable function, so that any kind of data that's presented, whether it's a list of schools, anything that was referred to as a directory, we can reevaluate that and find ways of having a reusable tool that we can use. So we started off with council tax as the most popular one, and car parks. So in council tax, we have more options, but car parks was more direct. So council tax have about 4 options. If you'd like to play the first option, Chris.
Sorry, through this clickable.
Yeah. So in the first option, we have, so we are presenting different ways of finding this information, but it's mainly based around the charges. There's lots of narrative data on the website under council tax. So this particular focuses on the charges, the banding, and the properties, individual properties or a group of properties at a postcode or an area. So the first option presents you with an option to choose the parish that you're in, and then you see the banding of your, sorry, if you go back one, yeah. So this one shows you how the charge per band, and just in the content above there, you have a place where you can go off to a different website to check what your band is. And then you just compare with this banding on your particular town or ward or parish. if you go to the next option, Chris, this one is focused on your particular property. So we give people the option to find their put in their postcode and choose the property, the particular property, and then gives you the very focused information about that particular property. At the bottom there, we have a link for statutory reasons that all this information should be publicly available, so someone can download all the table in a CSV format. So that is the second option. In the third option, if you put in your postcode, it will give you more. So it shows you the neighborhood, gives you a collection of all the properties in that postcode, and you can see yours among the others. At the same page, you have the link to download all the data for, if you need to use it for any reason, or just also for the statutory reasons that we are supposed to provide all this information publicly. So this is the third option. If you go to the next option, for people interested in looking at all the parish data or town council data, we have displayed them all like this in this option. We don't have a drop down because they might be a bit too long. This is more usable also for mobile. If you click on the first in A, it will give you all the charges in that particular parish, and they can still download that. I will check a properties band on the same page, from the same page. The last option, we try and put together all related information about a property. So given the context of someone looking for council tax about a property, might be interested in other things about their bin collection and the contacts of their parish councils and other information. So if you put in your postcode there, find your address, and it gives you that cluster of information. So you can start from there to find all this related information. If you're moving house, or it's all there, right there. So those are the 4 options we have. I don't know whether at this point I want to get some feedback or I should continue to Carfax. What do you think?
Chris, have we got the activity set up for voting for just council tax or car parks as well? Should we do?
It's just council tax.
Yeah. So let's just I guess focus on this. Has anyone got any questions on any of the options before we do the activity?
Yeah, I've got one. Sorry. So do you see this information output as perhaps a way of having the customer sign up to my account? Because in some ways it's a chance to maybe they get more information if they join the website, or you don't see it that way. This would just be free to everyone.
Yeah, we haven't gone as far as my account options. This is what's publicly available without any sign up.
Yeah, because it's almost like the plain option, is it? You got economy and business class, but obviously you get more with business class, don't you?
Is there? We will do a bit of more discovery about that. I think it will be another stream of work about my account, because it has a lot of other user needs and business needs. For now, this is like the initial go at directories, non-narrative data and how to present it. So it's definitely work in progress, and we're going to keep investigating, also using users to see their needs and trying to validate some of the concepts we have and questioning the conventions.
Yeah, looks good so far. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other comments, team? Otherwise, we're going to do a bit of an exercise on the options. If you can zoom in a little bit, Chris. So option A, version A, is a filterable table, if you can kind of imagine that. Version B is find your property charges. Version C is find all charges in the postcode. And version D, parish lists.
And we have the extra one, E.
And version E is combined postcode lookup, where it basically displays in brackets like a different life events as such, or different information with the icons. So Chris, Is this on Menti or chat?
On Menti.
On Menti. So if you still have Menti, or if you don't have it up, no worries, just go to menti.com and 63230364. And we've just got a question to poll the virtual room. Which version of council tax directory prototypes makes the most sense to you? So you should be presented with the visuals, I believe, and you should be able to, I guess, effectively dot vote remotely by placing your vote on which one makes the most sense for you. With the, I guess, the brief is find your council tax band.
Yeah, you can drag that blue dot around and then click submit.
Is it right if you zoom in, Chris, please?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Get it all in.
So at this, we are looking at desirability, isn't it? The first level of checking. Because I'm thinking the right you go is more about feasibility, viability, and how we can maintain and accomplish that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's that first thing. Because yeah, there's not much point in if the last version is, which is getting some of the most votes, is the least viable or the most resource intensive, it's worth seeing the desirability of it first. But yeah, the variety of these different kind of prototypes is really useful to test the variety of different ways you can access this information and what information you're seeing as well, because different users might have a different kind of context as to why they're looking for this information, and in how they would naturally look for it.
So we've got Juliet and Stephen mentioning that Menti won't let them click, but feel free just to drop which version you like in the chat. But very interesting to see the different layouts of this council tax band directory. And I think the plan is, if Panos and Lucy are on the call, they are aiming to get some friends, family, stakeholders to review, enable to get some user feedback to kind of validate and get any queries resolved before going to build. So that's, I guess, where we're using this prototype to gauge, are we solving the right question and are we building the right thing? See you, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for the votes. That's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for talking them through. All right. So yeah, we've just done that. That is what's that?
Yeah, I've got one exercise because we do have more time that Chris we can run at the end. I'm not sure if it will show because I hid them just in case we were over time.
Yeah, I think they're just after the thank you.
Yeah, cool.
In this deck, there is some links to some further reading. That list of methods that I was talking about is at the top, but there are also tools. So there's a lot of kind of free tools out there. Obviously, things like Figma, which we've just been using, are a bit more advanced for kind of high fidelity, but there are things that are really accessible to anyone. So something like Balsamiq is a really easy way of doing not just wireframes, but kind of more sketchy style wireframes. Because another thing that I think puts people off is that people don't want to necessarily draw or to write with their hands. So Balsamiq, it kind of bridges that gap. It's a wireframing for sketches. So it also helps you understand the kind of because one of the other things when it comes to wireframing that when people are first starting out is understanding the kind of the common patterns that people use. So like what an image looks like, which is often just kind of a square or a rectangle with an X across it, or like how you kind of quickly show there should be text in places. So all of those exist in something like Balsamiq as components you can just drag about. So you don't need to have any of that kind of prior knowledge, which is useful. And yeah, there's some other tools in there. But yeah, thanks. That is a brief kind of prototyping overview. We have another little activity we can do.
Yeah.
But before that, if there's any questions, let me know.
Robert said he had to dash, but he said it was very interesting, and thanks, Chris, in the chat.
And Juliet had asked whether that paper exercise, prototyping, whether there was a temptation to lead people down a certain path.
Yeah, so I mean that one example is it is a specific path. So there has to be a path in that example, because what they're testing there is more the content and the flow. So it's very similar to a clickable prototype where you have a single flow. You could potentially do it a lot more flexible if you invested the time to create all of the different variations and kind of choreograph that experience, or have someone there to do it, to put the right screens on. But yeah, in that one example, they were testing a specific flow because they'd given the user a set of tasks to do. So what they were really wanting to see is whether or not they could do it, what things they would click on to do it, and if the content made sense and the flow. So yeah, I think the answer is yes, it did lead them down a specific route, but on purpose.
Yeah, it makes sense because you're testing the stages of a specific flow is one path. The other question I have is from myself. Do you have a challenge of making people just be honest and not work harder because you've called them to test and they're, and you're watching them, or they might want to succeed more than if they were just not being cooperative, if they're not part of the project?
Yeah, I think it's often something that you struggle with when testing. So when you run testing sessions, obviously it's complete, everything is different, but it is an artificial situation. So it's harder to get. And like one of the things I often struggle with is especially if you've offered any kind of incentive for people. So sometimes we offer like, I don't know, like a £5 gift card for people to attend a testing scenario. They inherently want to be more positive because they see they're getting something of value. So trying to get people to answer more naturally and even negatively can be difficult. I think one of the things to help combat that that's really useful is having someone who's impartial run the session. So you having a dedicated user researcher who hasn't been involved in any of the designs is really useful, because obviously not only do they have experience in doing that kind of testing, but they can be in a more impartial situation. Because if you say, I mean, obviously, if you were running the testing and you were the one to design it, the other thing is to pretend you didn't, because if you say I designed this thing, people will tend to be more positive towards it. Whereas, so part of that is in the setup. It's that before you start testing with someone, it's explaining to them that there's no wrong answer, that everything like they're thinking or saying is valuable, and like you want to hear the truth, not you don't want kind of anything sugar coated.
And one thing that Chris, Ale, myself, and Fiona in the first phase of testing for the website prototypes is in the discussion guide, which is effectively like the script that you run through with the user. We actually explicitly say up front that the word kind of like user testing has implications about tests, like people who've never come to a testing session before may think they're themselves are getting tested. So in the script, we basically specify that it's not actually testing themselves, we're testing the design, and we are like going through and asking them, like Chris said, to kind of like speak aloud. There's no right or wrong answer, and making sure that we're not testing how they use it, we're testing the designs themselves. So that's a way to kind of make sure that, I guess, the willingness to succeed, like Lawrence that you mentioned, is kind of combated at the very beginning before they even see the prototypes.
And lastly, sorry, one more. Yeah. And how do you dissuade people from not giving their opinion in terms of how they would do it themselves? I've had a situation whereby someone was saying, if I was designing this website, I would have this search down here. You know, like how do you nicely tell people not to design it, but just to use it?
I mean, I guess part of it, I guess I wouldn't be trying to dissuade them from doing that, because sometimes it's useful. Like it's something I'd take note of, but not necessarily act on. Obviously, people have opinions, and I think that is where something like, obviously it depends on what you're trying to test, but that is where something like a paper prototype can really help, because it takes away the concept of design. Like obviously people can get bogged down with all the other stuff. When you create a high fidelity mockup, obviously you want to try and make it look like as real as possible, so you include all that extra stuff like the navigation, the header, the search, the footer. You include all that extra stuff to make it feel more real, but none of that is actually important to what you're trying to test. So it can get in the way, exactly as you're saying. Like someone might have an opinion on that when that's got nothing to do with what you're trying to test. But those opinions can also be useful, so it's good to take note of, and then just kind of steer them back to the original goal of running through the flow. Because I mean, if you're doing the testing right, you've asked them to think out loud. So that, to be fair, that is one of their thoughts, I guess. So it's not necessarily a wrong thing.
We actually had that. So search was a part of one of the last things we built, Chris. And I remember testing a session with Fiona about how someone would look for some information and they said, oh, we would just click the search box, and then went to click the search box in the clickable prototype, but that hadn't been hotspotted or like linked up yet. So I said to them, this is a prototype, this isn't the real designs, but what would you expect to happen next? And they would then explain that. And Fiona and I would ask why, depending on who was facilitating the session, and ask why a few times to try and gauge what the actual what they were trying to achieve. And then they realized that that's not, well, what would you click on next if there was no search? And then that's how we got them kind of like steering back to the actual specific flow that we were testing, which I think back then was the customer service complaint flow, which you saw previously.
Yeah, I mean, this is inherently one of the issues with the higher fidelity mockups. Is I've been in user testing where someone has like just could not understand the fact that it was not a real thing, if that makes sense. Like they saw it as the site. Actually, I think it may have even been a client one time that like, or sometimes people will assume, oh well, now you've got that, we can move on to the next thing really quickly. Like the site's already been built, whereas actually it's a set of flat screens that have been linked together. But yeah, user testing, Connolly, if you're looking for any more subjects for Lunch and Learns, we could do an entire hour or so session on user testing itself. I think it would
be worth. It's a kind of a skill that's needed to guide a testing session nice, so it doesn't become a discussion of things.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
I think we could do one end of June if people are interested in. I know the next session we're doing is Jay and Roxana are doing the machine learning and AI lunch and learn, which is going to be very different than the ones we've had. So yeah, that's a good idea, Chris. If there's not other questions, I'm just checking the chat. I've got a quick, great. Juliet saying sounds good. User testing session. We're going to have an activity just using the chat. I'm going to kind of like prototype an idea that may or may not happen in Northant. So hopefully Chris can go to the next slide. I did hide it because I didn't know how long we'd go, but effectively, if we can imagine that this is an idea. So imagine one of our ideas as a team is to suggest those who are able to self-serve and check out online resources do so. In this particular example, imagine we are doing a bit of a discovery for the kind of like housing and homelessness team at Northants, both West and North. And we think that an interactive step-to-step guide towards finding the right property will really help the residents. So these are things like practical interactive elements to basically allow a resident to understand what their options are at that moment in time and what they can do next. So initially, they could basically call the customer service line and a customer service person could tell them what to do. Obviously, that is very time intensive. What we would like to do is basically decrease or channel shift away from using the customer call center and allow them to self-serve for those that can self-serve. So these kind of like ideas, if we can imagine, it could include stories from residents about their own situation and what they did and potentially the outcome. So if you look at the screen in front of you, there's a kind of like a quick mock-up sketch about a call taker he mentions online, and there's resources online, and it's like great. The client or the resident finds guidance and useful links. Interesting one actually about the word client. In Coventry, one of the projects I worked on was for, and this is actually an idea that we're going to be talking about today, but their team didn't like using the word resident because they felt that they needed to hear the word client because it kind of like elevated the response level that people would serve their customers or so anyway, that's why the word client's there. So client finds guidance and useful links, and they share what they found the council for specific support. So you can kind of see if you just look at the diagrams, there's a call that happens as step one, or touch point, customer touch point, people used to say. They then check on their mobile phone how to find a property, details and how the council can help you, and basically they can then share that with a loved one or somebody else or the council, and then they could then potentially call the council or they could actually complete the task online. So this is a storyboard sketch of what we think the idea could take. Now I've got questions for you on the next slide, and if we could use the chat if we're still here. This will only take a 5-minute exercise. So Chris, if you go to the next slide for me. The first question is if you can imagine the idea is an interactive guide. I don't know if it's changed slide, Chris, for you. It hasn't for us.
Oh, it did for me. Is that now?
Yeah, it's changed for me too.
You see the blue bar at the bottom?
Chris, I think you're cutting out. Can anyone else hear Chris? Probably my side.
Can you hear me?
I think it's gonna keep cutting out, funnily.
Oh. But yeah, so the first question, why you assume this will work? Connolly, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Chris.
Connolly's frozen.
Messaging her, see if maybe she's lost internet. She's in the office. I can't see the chat, so I don't. It's hard to do this with just myself. And we're gonna assume people have.
Lawrence has just put in the chat that this will work because people are used to these kind of things, online experiences, apps with things like booking holidays, etc.
Interesting. Yeah. Based on kind of prior experience and prior knowledge. Yeah, it's often something that we compare council services to as a benchmark of saying, like, people expect that kind of experience from a digital experience if they're used to it.
Mike has also mentioned that this will work because a lot of people prefer to self-serve. Juliet has put, sorry, she can't speak because of her mic problems, but I think assumption would be that people would like to use a simple online process. And then Lawrence has also added that I also think it will work because it kind of lets people do things at their own pace, at their own time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can we go on to do the same exercise but write in the chat why you assume it will not work?
There's some other comments I'll read out. Tracy's also put, people want to access information that isn't tied to office hours and staff availability to answer phone calls. Gavin has posed a question: if the person is homeless, how do they have the internet? I'm guessing access the internet.
Yes, yeah, that's a good one for the assume this will not work, definitely.
And also Juliet has put in that people can go back and recheck multiple times. Steve has also put mobile frequently in self-service kiosks. And then George has put customers chose time to interact with the council.
Yeah, interesting. Sorry if you can hear all that messaging. It's Connolly saying that her Teams has crashed and it's not letting her back in. No worries. So the final thing is what could we do to validate our assumptions? So this is I guess where prototyping can come into this. So we have some assumptions you've written down, whether or not they are assumptions that it will work or will it not. But how can we validate these? Sorry, give me a shout when stuff's in the chat because I can't see.
In the chat, that it won't work because people say they just want to speak to somebody. But in terms of what's coming back with the, validate, we need to test a prototype. George says we need to test with users. Michael says user testing.
Yeah. So there's I guess there's for each kind of assumption there is different ways you can test it, and you could almost use a different prototype for each of them. So as we've seen, like we could be mocking up similar to these kind of sketches. We could be mocking up a higher fidelity kind of clickable experience prototype of this experience, but it could also be that that this is done much more kind of focused, which would obviously focus on how a user would interact with this service. But you could also kind of role play it or take it back to focus more on the actual experience or the service itself, or how the communication could work between these different channels, between the service and the user. So,
Lucy and Richard have added, could complete some A/B testing. A/B testing.
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's actually A/B testing. haven't mentioned that, but obviously that's a good way of testing 2 different prototypes. So something like that could be very useful in the prototyping work you're doing currently for the directories work. A/B testing, for anyone that doesn't know, sorry, is where you test two different things, or it could be more than 2, and you can test them simultaneously and see the different response you get for each of them. So that could be a different design, or it could be an entirely different flow or a different experience, or it could just be testing 2 different types of copy. Sometimes just having 2 different texts in a button can make such a difference in the actual testing. But yeah, I think that is the end of the presentation. It's been great seeing everyone again. Been a while, and yeah, I hope everything goes well going forward. But feel free to, I'm still on Slack, but feel free to give me a shout if there's any questions when it comes to prototyping or anything like that. And we'll also package up these slides and share them on.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's really refreshing. I hope everyone feels the same like I do. Also, see you again, and also very informative and very helpful information. I'm just trying to keep all this close in mind and
it's a massive area. Like, you could spend ages on it, and as I said, I think user testing is a really interesting one as well that could be done.
It feels to me like the most, I say, I'm biased, of course, the most important part of every process is to see to test, basically, to see whether it's a useful thing or not, or what people like. Could be a good concept, but if people don't like it for whatever reason, there's a lot of things that have failed from, in history, even like, MySpace, take the good concepts, but kind of fall by the wayside because people don't like them or they don't want to use them. So I guess the success of every project depends so much on validating this concept with users.
And user testing itself, I think, can be a bit intimidating, but it's something that is, I like. It's so useful for everyone to experience. Like, I've worked with like backend developers in the past who the moment they got into a user testing situation and got to see a user interacting with something, completely changed their perspective on it, which they wouldn't have ever kind of experienced. And like, if you have user testing completely separate, so there's a team of people who are just doing that, it becomes very much everything's getting filtered through them. So you kind of come to experience that and come to know it. So it's so useful having fresh sets of eyes, even if it's just kind of listening in, as obviously we have been doing throughout this process. But it's really useful. But yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.